Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 28th of November 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, of course, Mike Robinson. We're also joined today by Dr. Graham Downing and Mark Anderson of American Free Press. A lot happening.
Yes, let's get on with the Bank of England, the financial stability report out today, and it's all good news, Brian, because all the major UK banks have passed the Bank of England's annual stress test, and they could cope in the event of what the Bank of England describes as a disorderly Brexit. They said that this was the first year since it started conducting these stress tests that none of the big banks would need to improve their capital position. So that's good for the government because it's trying to sell off Royal Bank of Scotland, or is about to begin the process of selling off Royal Bank of Scotland at the moment. So at least for a PR point of view, that's great stuff. The Bank of England said the 2017 stress test shows that the UK banking system is resilient to deep simultaneous recessions in the UK and global economies, large falls in asset prices, and a separate stress of misconduct costs. Okay, so that's fantastic. They're resilient for misconduct costs. They can be as they can be as badly behaved as they like, and they can deal with that without any problems. Mark Carnage had this to say: the Financial Policy Committee is taking action to ensure the financial system is resilient. And Brian, this word resilient, the UK banking, so if you look at their infographic on the right-hand side there, the UK banking system is resilient. It's all about resilience.
This is all new speak.
Well, it's a policy, and we're going to come on to that in a second. And I got to say thank you very much to Martin Edwards, who pointed me at this morning, because this is CSC Leaders. This is the joint venture between Common Purpose and the Duke of Edinburgh's
Trust Foundation.
Yes, Windsor Leadership Trust, that's right. Correct. Thank you. Well, Theresa May's on their front page. This is quite incredible. What makes a city resilient? Well, she's written them a nice little letter because she has launched the 2018 CSC Leaders Challenge. And she is saying, it's my privilege to launch the CSC Leaders 2018 Challenge. And the challenge is, what makes a city resilient? In 1956, His Royal Highness, the Duke of Edinburgh, had the vision to bring together leaders from across the Commonwealth to tackle some of the world's most pressing challenges. Over 60 years later, in partnership with Common Purpose, CSC Leaders continues to give senior leaders representing a range of sectors from the Commonwealth 52 members the opportunity to come together to address complex global issues. The importance of the 2018 Global Challenge cannot be overstated. From terrorism to natural disasters and from financial stability to social unrest, the pressures on our cities are enormous. Over the coming months, the CSC Leaders alumni will be working together with many of the great Commonwealth businesses and industries to learn what makes organisations as well as cities resilient. So it's all about resilience. Now, what's interesting is, I wasn't going to mention the forthcoming royal wedding, but Prince Harry and Meghan, her name escapes me at the moment. They are getting married, of course. But what are they saying that they're going to be doing? They are going to be acting as change agents within the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth being pushed right to the forefront of global change, and resilience right at the heart of the Commonwealth agenda. So what's this all about? Well, to find out, as usual, you need to go to the UK Column website, and there we have an article written in June 2016 by Martin Edwards. The Resilient Cities Programme, another threat to individual liberties, is the question that he's asking. He says, pioneering and financially supported by the Rockefeller Foundation. He's talking about the 100 Resilient Cities project. He's talking about civil society and how that's being used to change our relationship to governance and so on. But let's take the first 100 Resilient Cities program as an example. And here's what they say on their website. This is Rockefeller Foundation. Crisis is the new normal for cities in the 21st century. Because of the collision of globalization, urbanization, and climate change, not a week goes by when there's not a disruption to a city somewhere in the world, a cyber attack, a natural disaster, or economic or social upheaval. And Brian, this is what it's about. At the center of this, they are driving chaos and crisis, and they're using crisis as the driver for crisis management, for driving the change in the way we are being governed, to driving the change in the relationship between the individual and the state, and of course, alongside globalization, urbanization, climate change, we could perhaps add terrorism and a number of other similar things, which are all generating this chaos, and chaos seems to be the central policy.
It is the central policy, Mike, and we have reported repeatedly over the last few months and weeks, of course, this statement by Danny Kruger, the advisor for David Cameron, who said that the Conservatives intended to bring in a period of what he called creative destruction, chaos, particularly within the civil service, and that's what we're seeing unfolding around us. But how shocking that we should have a Prime Minister, Theresa May, now fully in bed with this pernicious charity common purpose, which was getting into local authorities, steering their budgets to train its own graduates, working with the police force to do the same, into the military, and then breaking the Data Protection Act in taking the data of people who dared ask why public money was being spent on it. We then had the paedophiles that were discovered in the common purpose networks, Matthew Byrne being particularly a vile individual who was working with the Common Purpose Advisory Board, and yet this is the very organisation that Theresa May supports. How do you explain this, other than the government is fully supporting this disruptive change which Common Purpose is driving?
Absolutely.
Well, the government, what is the government? Is the government Westminster? Is the government about debate on the floor of the House? Apparently not. David Davis has just come out with this statement in relation to his Brexit talks. He said, given that we have received no assurances from the committee, this is the Westminster Committee, regarding how any Brexit information will be used, we've sought not to include commercially market and negotiation sensitive information. Delivering a successful outcome to our EU exit negotiations for the whole country requires keeping some information confidential for the purposes of the negotiations. So we've got closed door meetings around the so-called Brexit. We say Brexit is a complete and utter lie. Why do they need to keep it secret? Because it is a lie. But this is the key thing, that some of the MPs are complaining that they've been denied this information. So I've put a few words into the mouth of David Davis. These backbenchers like Seema Malhotra still don't get it. Just because they're elected MPs does not mean they're involved in running the country. That's the job of the Cabinet Office and Privy Council. And what we do behind closed doors is no business of, sorry, that should be theirs. So go away, little girl. So Common Purpose, driven from the Cabinet Office in the United Kingdom, Theresa May in bed with Common Purpose, and MPs now being brushed off. Don't bother us with your stupid little questions. We are in power. We conduct government behind closed doors. It's almost like Stalinist Russia, Mike.
Worse. Okay, well, look, yesterday we highlighted this absolutely spectacular piece of fake news from The Sun. Flu lies. Russian cyber units spreading slurs online about flu and measles jabs in the UK. Well, what I hadn't appreciated, Brian, and thank you very much for bringing it in today, was that actually this story had made it onto the front page of yesterday's Daily Mirror. So underneath the
boob job,
the boob job and the bake-off, we had this story and multiple pages inside on it as well.
Do you want to just read that headline, Mike?
The headline says, Russia's lies over flu jabs in Britain. Kremlin puts lives at risk by spreading fear over vaccines. And inside they specifically single out the MMR vaccine in that case. So perhaps it's a good time to bring Graham Downing onto the programme. Welcome to the programme, Graham. What were your first thoughts when you saw that front page yesterday?
Do you know what? I've got a horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach, because I thought, when you know people lie, it's one thing. When they do it so blatantly in a British newspaper, it's just a very disturbing feeling living in this country when we've got to that level. I think as I said to you earlier, Mike, does anybody actually believe this? That's the question. Is anybody actually truly believing this nonsense?
Well, I think the answer to that is no, and I think you know, the more desperate we see these headlines become, the more it's going to become obvious to people what's going on around them. But Graham, let me bring this on screen. This was pushed out by the World Health Organization yesterday, and the headline is, "Why is vaccination important for addressing antibiotic resistance?" And they say vaccines can help limit the spread of antibiotic resistance. The global increase in disease caused by drug-resistant bacteria due to the overuse and misuse of antibiotics is a major public health concern. It's more difficult and costly to treat antibiotic-resistant infections and people do not always recover. Vaccinating humans and animals is a very effective way to stop them from getting infected and thereby preventing the need for antibiotics. Making better use of existing vaccines and developing new vaccines are important ways to tackle antibiotic resistance and reduce preventable illness and death. Expanding the use of existing vaccines will reduce the use of antibiotics and the development of resistance. For example, if every child in the world received a vaccine to protect them from infection from pneumonia, from the pneumonia bacteria, which can cause pneumonia, meningitis, and middle ear infections, this would prevent an estimated 11 million days of antibiotic use a year. Vaccines against viruses such as the flu also have a role to play because people often take antibiotics unnecessarily when they have symptoms such as fever that can be caused by a virus. Now, can we start, Graham, just by answering this question? What do antibiotics have to do with viruses?
Well, antibiotics won't treat a virus. So that's the first thing. I mean, you know, you may argue that if you get ill and you get a virus, it makes you ill, and then you might be more prone to a secondary infection, and then they may have to be used. But the reason we're in this problem or in this mess is because the WHO and all the medical doctors in this country and around the world have been pumping these antibiotics out like sweets. And all the holistic doctors, the naturopathic doctors for many, 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 many years, even Sir Alexander Fleming, it was in 1928, with benzyl penicillin, the man who invented all this stuff, well, at least in the West anyway, he said, look, when you use this stuff, you've got to be judicious. And they went, okay, then, and then they completely ignored him. So we have a problem which has been created, unfortunately, by the medical profession. And now who do we go to solve it? Well, apparently we've got to go back to the medical profession, and now they're going to create another problem because they now want to vaccinate the world to clear up the first problem. So it's a very, very circular going downward spiral, in my opinion.
Okay, well, let's just have a look at a couple of the questions that they asked in this document. How can existing vaccines have an impact? And their answer that they give is that expanding the use of existing vaccines will reduce the use of antibiotics and the development of resistance. And this goes to the example that I gave a second ago, that every child in the world, if every child in the world received a vaccine to protect them from the pneumonia, the bacteria that causes pneumonia, that would reduce or prevent an estimated 11 million days of antibiotic use. Now, you've put some additional stuff on this.
Yeah, so when you talk about data, you have to talk about all the data. You don't just talk about one side of the data, because if you do that, you're going to end up in another problem where we are now, because they only looked at one side of it before and gave everybody antibiotics. So now we're back in this sort of very, very myopic scientific way of looking at things, well, unscientific. And the first thing is that when you vaccinate, you will never, ever, ever, ever eradicate a disease. It's just not going to happen. There's lots of technical reasons why that is. One of the things you get is strain, what we call strain replacement, is you have many, many different strains, say of a pathogen, if you like, and you target one of them, immediately you start to cause problems with the others. Others which were benign and maybe not a problem suddenly become dangerous. And there's two studies that I've quoted there. The top one is the more recognized idea, which is scientifically well accepted, that you do have strain replacement, and it specifically says, it's specifically talking about pneumococcal disease and serotypes. And underneath, there's a more recent paper, which now says, well, we've got a different idea now. We don't think you just have strain replacement. What we think is that the actual vaccines themselves are causing genetic changes and actually making the other strains far more dangerous. So it's as a direct effect of the vaccine on these bugs, if you like. So to suggest that you're just going to start vaccinating everybody and all the problems are going to go away, I think that is grossly misunderstanding the science. And I think, quite frankly, you're bordering on scientific fraud because you're not looking at both sides of the coin.
And you have another one here, and here it says, here we show in mice that vaccination with LAIV primes the upper respiratory tract for increased bacterial growth and persistence of bacterial carriage in a manner nearly identical to that seen following wild-type influenza virus infections. So this has come as a following a vaccination, is that right?
Yeah, okay, so in the schools since 2013, they've introduced the nasal spray for flu, and which it also mentions in this WHO document, we should, vaccinate for flu. And that would be great because that will save antibiotics. Well, what they failed to mention is they've done studies, and if you vaccinate with this stuff, it increases the very bacteria in the nose of the kids that they're suggesting is problematic. And if you look at the graph on the right, without getting too technical, you see different lines, different colored lines, green line at the bottom, another colored line, and the graphs are kind of going up. Each one of those colored lines represents a year. And on the side, you've got, if you like, the incident rates of pneumococcal disease, which are linked to all these pneumonias and stuff. And these are allegedly the non-vaccine strains. But what you do see is, I've put there a big arrow, you see a massive break. In other words, they've really jumped up. And that was the exact same time they introduced this nasal spray, this flu nasal spray, into the schools. That was the year it jumped. And as we see from the paper on the left, if you increase the very bacteria that cause pneumonia and pneumococcal disease, you may expect to see a jump. So we have scientific evidence suggesting it happens, and then we have actual real data showing that it may be happening. And other people can argue about this data, no problem with that. But to not even understand this, or not even highlight this and put this on the other side of the coin, once again, I think is incredibly myopic.
And well, more papers here. The top one here saying that the vaccinated were significantly more likely than the unvaccinated to have been diagnosed with pneumonia.
Yeah, trying to get a really good study which says, okay, let's just compare vaccinated kids to unvaccinated. And once again, I'm going to say this isn't let's not vaccinate talk. I'm not doing that. I think the dogs had a vaccine. Yeah, just on cue. This is not that. I'm not suggesting you don't go get vaccinated. Talk to your GP, make your own decision, but be informed. I'm suggesting you need to look at all the evidence. This evidence was a small study because they won't do these studies. And in this study clearly showed that the vaccinated were far healthier than the unvaccinated. And underneath, this is a paper that highlights a concept in immunology called original antigenic sin, is that if you vaccinate someone year on year for the flu, seasonal flu, you will alter the immune system in such a fashion this suggests that you may make it vulnerable to a pandemic, which means when a pandemic comes along, you're going to have a problem fighting it, compared to someone who hasn't been vaccinated. And this is all topsy-turvy. This is the complete opposite of what they're saying. So when you say, let's just vaccinate everyone, I'm highlighting you are going to cause more and more problems by doing that, possibly.
Hold on, Graham. So if we listen to what the government has been saying on this for quite a number of years now, they're saying that there's a danger of a pandemic. There's one expected down the pipe at some point within the next few years. And therefore, we've all got to make sure that we're vaccinated because that is going to protect us from a pandemic. You seem to be saying that the scientific literature reports that actually quite the opposite is the case.
Yeah, and different people will argue in the scientific literature. What I'm suggesting is they're quite definitely avoiding these papers and not telling you about these papers. These papers suggest very strongly, through a mechanism called original antigenic sin, that if you vaccinate someone year on year, you lock that immune system to just reacting to that very thing you're vaccinating for. And everyone knows that strains, there are different strains, things change. You get something called immune escape, and you get other things as well, which allow different strains or slightly different variants to come into the system. And your immune system is going to be locked in to not recognizing it. And that's called original antigenic sin. And these papers suggest strongly that if you get that flu vaccine every year, when the pandemic comes along, you're not going to fare very well.
Well, this one suggesting that schools are receiving the largest number of outbreaks or getting close to that.
Okay, well, this is from Public Health England. So this is our data. They introduced The flu vaccine score in 2013, you look at the increase, that's over 2,600% increase in outbreaks since they introduced it. And one of the reasons is you've got something called numbers needed to treat. How many kids do you have to vaccinate in order to prevent one person from getting the flu, allegedly? Some of these numbers needed to treat are absolutely through the roof. And you have to vaccinate hundreds and thousands of kids to get the benefit of one person allegedly benefiting from it. And we know from the licensing literature that with these vaccines, that 1 in 10 or 1 in 11 kids will get an influenza-like illness. They will become ill, and the symptoms are identical to the flu. And you also get problems with breathing and increased problems with asthma. So when you start to look at these numbers, you're going to get more kids get ill in school, and their own data reflects that. And if this vaccine is so successful, why are the outbreaks going up in school?
Yeah, this is a good question. Now, before I read out what Dr. Mack has said here, who is Dr. Mack?
Dr. Mack is the world's leading expert in smallpox. And I often quote him because this is the one thing you'll go to your doctor and you said, well, vaccines are great. I'm not saying vaccines aren't great or are not great. I'm not getting involved in that kind of dichotomy. All I'm saying is you need to see all the evidence. And one of the things they always say is, well, vaccines got rid of smallpox. That is just not founded on science. And Charles Mack, Dr. Charles Mack, is the world's leading expert in smallpox. He has tackled it and dealt with it as a doctor and as a leading expert. And he was, because of his knowledge, he was brought in to a hearing to give evidence, to give testimony, and you can read what he says.
Well, he says, I would expect a small number of cases. I think that airborne spread would be relatively inefficient, and I don't think very many cases would occur. That's just giving you my personal opinion. The informed consent is that you would have to prepare to vaccinate somebody in the public. If it's honest, would have to say that the dangers would exceed the benefits. If people are worried about endemic smallpox, it disappeared from this country not because of our mass herd immunity. It disappeared because of our economic development, and that's why it disappeared from Europe and many other countries, and it will not be sustained here even if there were several importations. I'm sure it's not from universal vaccination. So he seems to be quite clear in saying that the data shows that smallpox, as an example, was removed from the American population as a result of economic development and not as a result of mass vaccination.
Yeah, and this holds true for pretty much across the board. You could argue there may be some different examples, but at least you should understand that. Now, he's an expert in it, and he's turned around and said it's nonsense to suggest that vaccination got rid of smallpox. There's a whole story in the history of that, going back to Leicester in this country. But he was actually responding to a question, what if terrorism, bioterrorism? They're always pushing this fear of bioterrorism. And Mr. Bill Gates recently at the Davos conference is pushing this, and they're pushing this thing, creating this chaos and fear in order to bring in these measures. And when you actually look, and the thing is, what you just read out there, very few, if any, medical doctors and scientists in this country actually know what you just read.
Okay, well, of course, at the heart of this, Graham, is this idea that antibiotics aren't working anymore. And this is something that you introduced to a UK column run event back in, I think, was it 2012 or something? And you were highlighting this book by Professor Dame Sally C. Davies, who, remind me what position she held at the time?
Chief Medical Officer.
Right. And so the drugs that don't work. And on the right, we have a report on this. The world is facing apocalyptic threat from resistant superbugs and so on. So this is the media. Actually, I think that article came from some time after you made that presentation to our event. But in the book itself, there are a couple of quotes that you wanted to highlight from this. What's she giving here? Some kind of scenario, potential future scenario? Is that what she's? Is that the way she's written the book?
Well, if you see that lecture online, I was in Bishop Stortford with my children, and I was popping to a bookshop. They went off to the children's section, and I just searched the health section. At that time, I'd been speaking out quite vocally on this antibiotic resistance, and no one was really doing anything about it. Medical colleagues were not interested. Either dentists I knew, they didn't even know about it. And I was quite shocked that no one knew about it. And then I went into a bookstore and just saw this book. I thought, wow, someone's actually finally writing something about this. And then when I read it, it's a truth now. My jaw fell on the floor because this, and if you want to, I've just put a few quotes, you want to read them, but this is her imagining a future that we're going to come into.
Right. So the future she imagines, she says, a few years later, shortly after Josh joined primary school, the government passed new laws making it a criminal offence for the infected to be in public. There were talks of random tests in the street. And then she goes on to say, if you were contagious, you would be committed to one of the isolation sanatoriums that were being built on the edge of all major towns. This was a death penalty. They were referred to as colonies. Well, there's a bit of this in popular culture. I remember the BBC. I can't remember the name of the program. It was sort of a spin-off from Doctor Who, was imagining exactly this type of scenario. So we're seeing this in popular culture as well as in a book written by a senior medical professional.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's terrifying. I mean, you know, and as I said, how the hell does anyone get permission? I mean, in her position, she would have had to been signed off to put that into a book.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then the question is, well, what were you doing about it? And we actually put a conference on showing there's other ways of dealing with these infections other than just relying on antibiotics. But you know, that was one of the points of doing that. But I think that's astounding. What those quotes.
Right, and Graham, I just wanted to end on this this particular BBC article because I thought the headline was absolutely despicable. Give child super spreaders the flu vaccine, say experts, and they're pushing this idea that we need to vaccinate every child with this. And actually, you know, Brian, I don't know what you think of the photograph on that, but I found that image a little bit disturbing, like it was being forced.
Well, it was,
but the idea that children are super spreaders to be feared, the headline is implying that we've got to just look at children as danger objects.
Well, I think we're going to be covering a bit more on children a little bit later in the news, Mike, but we are seeing a massive attack on children. Why is there a massive attack on children, on their bodies and their minds? Because they represent our future. If you deal with the children, that's the future sorted out.
Graham, any final comment on that?
Yeah, that flu vaccine doesn't work.
Okay.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work, period. And in America, even with the CDC, which has been found absolutely lying to cover up the vaccines, had to admit it doesn't work. It's about, they estimated its efficacy was minus 23%.
Okay. Okay. Well, look.
So,
yeah.
In actual fact, one last thing: if you just give vitamin D3, about 1,200 IU, 2,000 IU to a child, that has been shown in double-blinded, placebo-controlled studies in hospital to be more powerful than the antiviral drugs and the vaccines. But it doesn't make anybody any money.
And this seems to be the central message. Graham, thank you very much for joining us today. We'll speak to you again very soon, I'm sure. Now, let's move straight on. I appear to have slightly messed up these.
We've got dogs barking today, Mike. Yeah, I wouldn't worry about it.
I'm not going to worry too much about this.
We're celebrating.
I do apologise, Mark. Let's bring Mark Anderson into the programme. Mark, you were looking at the 2017 Halifax International Security Forum recently. There was some interesting stuff going on there. Give us an overview.
Well, you know, it's kind of funny what you were talking about with Graham about vaccines, this internal war on the internal human biological systems by the establishment. They claim to be fighting disease when in fact, in many respects, they're promoting disease. Well, take that microcosmic philosophy or outlook and put it in a macrocosmic perspective, and you have what these think tanks are up to, basically. Under the guise of standing for peace and democracy, they are actually conducting warfare on sovereignty and on the idea of self-rule or self-determination of countries. And under the guise of pushing peace, they're constantly preparing for war. So just as we have a war on children through vaccinations and the future through children, we have a war on sovereignty under the guise of peace. It's funny how the macro and the micro go together when it comes to the ruling establishment. Anyway, the Halifax Forum up in Canada happened right after the World Affairs Council of America conference in Washington, D.C., and the Trilateral Commission even met in the UK in early November, just as a footnote. But at the Halifax International Security Forum, and this is only about an 8 or 9-year-old gathering, many of the other think tanks have been around a lot longer. At this, just for example, they had a video where they honored Nadia Murad, who's this social celebrity now. ISIS reportedly raped a number of her relatives a couple of years ago when Nadia was a 21-year-old student. And through a video posted on the Halifax International Security Forum website during and in the wake of this mid-November conference, they have this idea that they use Nadia as kind of a, as I say, social celebrity, political football, or stepping stone to promote the idea that world peace will come through empowering women. But by empowering women, they mean militarizing women. They mean the idea that the natural feminine and natural nurturing tendencies, the very nature of women as you know, as a God-given thing, that nurturing spirit in women, that God-given thing needs to be overturned, and women need to be inducted into the military. And in fact, the video that's posted after they show Nadia being honored for overcoming what happened to her family by these ISIS militants and the rape and the torture and all this stuff that reportedly happened, they show many images on this video of women being regimented and being marched around like soldiers and in full infantry fatigue and carrying fully automatic rifles and marching in formation, and the idea that they can man up and be just like men. And they'll do things like they'll show the word manpower, and they'll show women marching in formation with their rifles or during basic training, and then they'll remove the word man and simply show the word power under the women being marched in a regimented fashion. And behind this, there's a song playing, "I am a superwoman, yes I am. I am a superwoman, yes I am." These are the lyrics to the song. So Mike and Brian, what we're seeing here is a war on gender. And these people that are so dedicated toward peace and democracy at the Halifax International Security Forum are actually overturning the idea of the basic natural made, the natural structure of humanity, and driving women into the idea of being soldiers and to come home in body bags rather than being the nurturers, the God-given nurturers of society. So it's amazing that the people that conduct these and other think tanks can get off saying that they're so in favor of peace and democracy and healing the world, when in fact they're constantly at war with the world, whether it's through the vaccine system, whether it's through being gender benders and having a war on gender, and in so many other areas. So this is one of the things that jumped out at me. Another thing I'll mention very quickly is that a video, another one posted on the Halifax website, shows the atomic bomb being dropped on Japan. And in one sense, it seems to be saying that, that's a bad thing. The title of the video was Nukes, the Fire and the Fury. And there was an associated conference discussion at the Halifax event about nukes. But the short video basically romanticizes the atom bomb being dropped on Japan. There's even kind of cabaret jazz music playing in the background. And part of it is kind of eerie. The lyrics say, "We'll meet again some sunny day," implying that the sun is actually the atom bomb going off. "We'll meet again some sunny day." And so you have these dystopian and disturbing videos that show the world being overturned under the guise of democratic advancement and under the guise of peace. And so I'm covering some pretty broad ground here, but this is the mentality, this is the ideology of what we're seeing at the Halifax forums and some of the related forums conducted by the One Worlders.
Okay, and you mentioned the Future American Leadership, the WACA conference as well. That took place around the same time.
Yeah, it took place just before Halifax. That one, that one on the surface sounds a little bit more, quote, benign than the Orwellian dystopian things that were shared at the Halifax event. The WACA conference has been going on a lot longer. The World Affairs Council of America is a big umbrella group, and under it is some 90 World Affairs Councils and Institutes of World Affairs that dot the U.S. landscape that I've occasionally mentioned before on your program. It's like having a little Chatham House in your neighborhood, you might say. And at that event was America's role in the world, a bipartisan conversation. It included Senator Jeff Flake, a Republican from Arizona, who's very anti-Trump, very anti-America first, and Senator Jeff Merkley, a Democrat from Oregon. Very mixed bag there. Another one at the WACA conference in D.C. right before Halifax was Nancy Lindborg, president of the United States Institute of Peace. She was at Halifax as well as the World Affairs Council of America event in D.C., and she was among those that spoke of the idea of achieving peace through empowering women, and that empowering women involves necessarily militarizing them, putting a gun in their hand, having them downplay or abandon motherhood and abandon their better feminine instincts, and to become just like men, fighting alongside men to enforce the New World Order. And then also, and this might interest Graham, AI, artificial intelligence, was covered by Anand Shah, Senior Vice President of the Albright Stonebridge Group. AI and the Future of Work, that was covered at the DC World Affairs Council of America event. And the Albright Stonebridge Group, of course, is Madeleine Albright's group. Madeleine Albright being the Clinton-era Secretary of State, who was quoted as saying that when 500,000 Iraqis died, when Western forces went after the weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein never really had, when 500,000 Iraqis died, she was quoted as saying, "We really think it was worth it."
Yeah.
So this is what happened there. Another topic was forever wars. Get this, forever wars and U.S. national security. That was another WACA DC conference topic. Also, North Korea's nuclear quest, which is very interesting. The U.S. being so hypocritical in being the top possessor and the only user in history of nuclear weapons, but constantly on the look should Iran or North Korea get even one viable nuclear weapon. And then NAFTA and the new trade agenda, also discussed at the D.C. conference. And I just wrote an article coming up, maybe you'll want to cover this in a moment, about NAFTA being renegotiated, and the Trump administration is hedging against it, having a card in its back pocket to play, and that card is that the U.S. conceivably could pull out of NAFTA if it's not renegotiated in a, quote, America First fashion. So these are the highlights, among other things. The only other thing I'll mention, guys, is at the Halifax conference, there were some 21 journalists there, the BBC, PBS, Le Monde, Associated Press, and so on and so forth. And these journalists, when you think about fake news, it's not just the telling of falsehoods. It's not just twisting or bending the narrative, like the article that we saw recently where Vladimir Putin is supposedly to blame for, countering vaccines or being against vaccines. The real fake news, or the basis of fake news, is the fact that these journalists, the ones we call journalists, the ones we trust, are constantly colluding with these one world groups like the Chatham House, like the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, the Trilateral Commission, the World Affairs Council of America, and the Halifax International Security Forum. The journalists are taking part with the military brass and the Chatham House people and the Council on Foreign Relations people and colluding with them. They're not standing apart like the journalistic tradition and reporting on these organizations.
Sorry,
And
Mark,
so
this is a very important point, Brian, because Mark's saying the BBC was at the Halifax International Security Forum, but the BBC didn't report on the Halifax International Security Forum. So
certainly not that we've seen.
So they must have been taking part in some other way then.
Yeah, this is what happens. The journalists are completely betraying their craft. it's not just that they write falsities much of the time, it's that they're doing the wrong thing. They're supposed to be there covering it, not taking part in making the basic arguments and framework for future policy. Journalists are not supposed to be policymakers in the strict sense of the word. So this is really where the basis of fake news is coming from, and Bilderberg and all these other think tanks form this network in which the journalists are completely abusing their craft and betraying the public trust. So much more could be said about these organizations, but this is the broad framework of what's been happening lately at Halifax and the other forums.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for that report. That's fantastic. Well, perhaps Mark's comments lead into this quite nicely.
Well, it's incredible, isn't it, Mike? So Mark was talking about world peace by empowering women, and several people flagged this Breitbart article up. Girl Guiding UK allows Transgender Guides to share showers tents with girls. Girl Guiding Chief Executive Julia Bentley stated that the move to allow male children to join as guides allows rules set out in the Equalities Act 2010, which makes clear organisations providing single gender services should treat people according to their acquired gender. And we now know that that acquired gender is whatever an individual chooses to call themselves on a particular day of the week. Well, we spoke to the Girl Guides team this morning, and we got a response from their PR officer. This is the statement. They've given back exactly what we've already had up on screen, but they say if a young person doesn't feel comfortable sharing accommodation for whatever reason, we encourage them to talk to their leader about alternative accommodation and facilities. More private areas for changing can be made available to any young member who requests it. We also provide guidance for our leaders to help them when handling sensitive issues. So the child who's happy with their sexuality but says, I don't really want to share a shower with a boy, that girl is then excluded from the showers. She's isolated and put in her own shower. So amazing conversation. I'll come back to my discussion with the PR officer, but let's have a look at the chief executive. Here she is, Ms. Bentley. So that's the quote from the main part of the paper. There we are. In line with our values of inclusion, we welcome any young person who self-identifies as a girl or young woman. So it's only what you choose. And of course, this doesn't just relate to the Girl Guides themselves. This also covers staff. So I did ask the PR lady whether she would be happy to share a shower with a man who identified himself as a woman, but she didn't want to answer that question. She just came back on the government guidance. And Breitbart, a little while ago, 2013, also reported that the Girl Guides had decided to do away with any mention of God because that was a bit messy and it could discourage some people from joining. Well, what's this about? You get a clue from the website itself, because if you have a look at the Girl Guiding website, what you are faced with is political campaigning, social action. This is more change agenda, and this is a big attack on young girls and young women. Action for change, campaign to end sexual harassment, girls matter. Well, clearly girls don't matter because they're saying you can be a boy and join the Girl Guides. But what a fascinating lady the chief executive is, because she's able not only to do Girl Guiding, she's also part of DHL UK Foundation. That's at the top of her little CV there. And I encourage you to go and have a look at this. This is DHL, the deliveries company. There's Ms. Bentley, and I just thought it was interesting that one of her board members is John Nestor, investment management, latterly with UBS Global Asset Management, and on it goes.
It's amazing how the bankers all become philanthropists.
The bankers have all become philanthropists, and everybody wants to get close to children to help them empower themselves and be who they need to be. And I'll just end on this one, which Breitbart had embedded in the article on Girl Guides. Primary schools adopting the plan faster than secondaries, and this is LGBT curriculum program gender neutral uniforms adopted. So let's remind ourselves this is policy, and this policy has been created by a number of people through government and of course the policy advisors behind them. And it's quite clear this policy has come in with equal force across both the Conservative and the Labour administrations. So a massive attack on young girls and the identity of children as a whole. And we know that this attack can cause long-term psychiatric damage of these young children. Time parents spoke out, I think.
Very quickly, Mark.
I can't help but observe that right as the one worlders and the think tanks and their associated institutes are saying that women need to largely leave the home or at least downplay their motherhood and enter the military. So as parenthood is steered off the cliff in that direction, the kids themselves are confused in their gender and told there really is no such thing as gender. At the very same time, out of the other side of the mouth, you might say, the flip side of the coin. So clearly, the one worlders and their associates in banking and journalism are, even if they don't quite realize it, they're at war with the world while saying that they're out to solve the world's problems and create world peace. It's really the ultimate hypocrisy that we can imagine, and deception.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much for that excellent analysis, Mark. That brings us to the end of today's news. Some of you may have thought that you heard a dog barking during our news today. I have to say that was my dog, Megan, who of course is immensely excited that she's just been promoted to Princess, Mike.
Yes, but yes.
Princess Markle. It's confusing, isn't it?
Very.
We'll end there. Thanks very much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.